Well, hello, everyone who's out there in the world. I'm your host, Gonzalo Herrero, and today I have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Samantha Hayes to the Rise 41 podcast. Samantha is also known as the Performance OT on Instagram. Um, she is, excuse me, an occupational therapist, a hybrid athlete, and strength coach. So you're an athlete too. We'll talk about that. With Vital Point Therapies. She specializes in training women for strength, longevity, and performance. And today we will be talking a bit about how we should approach women's fitness and training and how this may differ from the more traditional coaching and fitness approaches that so many may not be aware of. So, with that, welcome, Sam. Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on here this morning. Like you mentioned, I have a background in occupational therapy. I have worked in pretty much every setting, clinical setting in the traditional healthcare system. In August, I decided I was going to branch out on my own, start training women for a lot of different reasons. I have been a barbell athlete for the last 9 years. So, focusing my personal fitness on strength training. I'm currently training for a high rocks competition in May. So it's a little bit different style of training than what I'm used to, but keeping me active, keeping me challenged, which I love. Um, and I work with a lot of powerlifters, a lot of hybrid athletes. My goal is to keep people in the gym and manage injuries more efficiently so people aren't having to take time off. Making them feel supported, building confidence in the process of doing so.
So, a couple of quick questions just to level set for our audience who may be new to the fitness
Yeah.
game, if you will, or lifestyle. So, let's define what powerlifting is for them or what a powerlifting competition is to a new person, to a lay person. What would that be like?
Yeah, so powerlifting is basically a competition where you are judged on the amount of weight that you can lift in the squat, bench, and deadlift movement patterns. And so the goal of the competition is to lift as much weight as possible. Along with that, often comes injuries when mistrained. So that's
Right.
kind of where I step in, helping people get to their goal weight that they want to lift while also managing that risk of injury, keeping that low in the process of getting there. So yeah, the goal of the competition is to lift as much weight in the squat, bench, and deadlift.
So again, for the new folks amongst us who may be new to strength sports, so uh, powerlifting is about efficiency. It's about how much weight you can lift in the most efficient manner, versus say
Yep.
bodybuilding, where the approach is you can make a weight way more than it actually does in the pursuit of building muscle tissue and for
Yep.
aesthetics, say. So
Yeah.
okay, so needless to say, with powerlifting, large loads, large potential for injury if you don't recruit muscle correctly, if your movement patterns are wrong, and I assume that's where you come in, right?
Yes, yes, and a big thing with powerlifting, at least from my experience that I have seen, is especially in the aging population. So as we get older, people that have been competing for 10 plus years, depending on the training that they've been going through, the risk of injury also could potentially go up, depending on how much attention they are putting towards injury prevention in the training process. So, what I see typically is when I get clients that have been working with powerlifting coaches in the past, is that their training is very specific to squat, bench, and deadlift, but
Right.
we neglect kind of the other planes of movement. So the rotational plane, twisting and turning, power, those types of things get missed, which is where injuries can kind of start to creep in when we're not training our bodies in kind of all planes of movement.
Gotcha. So is it sagittal plane mostly? Is that right? Is that the
Yes,
correct? Like,
yes, yes.
so because in that
Because you're
sport,
moving
those
up and
three,
down.
yeah, it's up and down, and it's those three core movements are the ones that are being measured or competed.
Yeah,
So
yep,
what you're looking for sounds like a combination of there's the performance aspect, but then there's the longevity aspect. And I think a lot of
yep.
people and you rightly said, don't realize that there's a huge difference between training for longevity and mobility and all around health versus training for performance. And when you
Correct.
train for performance, if am I correct in assuming that there's a higher risk of injury because you're pushing the
Yeah.
limits rather? Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, yes, I think you're correct in that, in when we neglect kind of other planes of movement, we're not training the muscles in those planes, right? And so in your day-to-day life, you typically use all muscles of your body in all planes. Like think about bending over and picking your kid up, right?
Right.
If you have little kids, so that twisting motion, we want to make sure we're training, all of that to build resilience in our movement patterns outside of just the squat, bench, deadlift
So
movements.
your approach is to have an all-around, a well-rounded athlete or person who's interested in fitness.
Right.
So okay,
Yep.
and now we go to the big elephant in the room, and the reason, like we started chatting, and why we're doing this podcast, it's that I think a lot of people may have a strange idea, not a strange idea, but a logical idea that training humans is the same across the board without realizing, like what we spoke about, that a training a female athlete, a woman, biologically different, is not the same as training a, say, smaller man. It has its own peculiarities and so on. Can you share with us the
Yeah. Some of those differences. Um, so in regards to powerlifting in general, two of the most common things I see in women are um, pelvic weakness. So women that lift, deadlift, and they have some sort of leakage, right? So um, that is like urinary incontinence with the
sure?
pressure because their pelvic floor muscles are not strong enough to withhold the load that they are deadlifting. So um, some people think this is not a problem. It is a huge problem, especially when you are at the age of, childbirth and preparing, if you're somebody that is preparing to have children at some point in time. Definitely a big, big red flag if you're having a urinary incontinence and should be addressed in your powerlifting training. So that's something that I think often gets missed or overlooked in women's health, especially in powerlifting. And another thing is SI joint pain. So you have a joint kind of in your low back region. It's also part of the pelvis. But women tend to tweak this joint frequently. Um, Sometimes it's due to load management in their training. So they're lifting too much weight too quickly.
Right.
Sometimes it has to do with form. Sometimes it has to do with core engagement. Sometimes it has to do with, again, the pelvic muscles and how they're all integrated in the strength of those to support the load. And so I think in regards to powerlifting, these are the two most common things I see in lifting in general. Um, as women, we've got to think of kind of the hormonal changes that we go through
Right.
on a monthly basis, especially in the younger populations. As you get older, the risk of you decrease bone density, right? So women have a higher risk of developing osteoporosis as they get older. So making sure that they're training in a way to work against kind of those, I don't want to call them diseases, but those changes that occur as you age, making sure that your strength training is set up in a way that you're setting yourself up in building, progressing as you age.
Excellent. Now, for, say, somebody who's looking into becoming fit, perhaps using powerlifting as an activity that's fun and that starts you down that fitness path, what
Yeah.
would you recommend to somebody who's perhaps new, a neophyte, that you would counsel, somebody who would reach out to you for training? What can they expect?
Yeah. So, and again, this is all, like you said, dependent on where we're starting. And so for me, my approach is typically I will do an initial kind of assessment, a trial, couple weeks, just to see kind of where we're at. From there, I always recommend if you're like a complete newbie, you're trying, maybe you've done group fitness, but you're trying to kind of branch out and do a little bit more personalized custom training geared more towards your goals, I always recommend people sticking to the compound movements, right? So
Okay.
those involve way more muscles of your body at once. And I also recommend people sticking to machines. Machines do have
Okay.
their place. And I think, especially in the newer lifting populations, they're super beneficial to get movement patterns down before moving to like a barbell or a free weight, making sure that stability is there, again, from an injury prevention, as well as just setting yourself up for success.
So the machines for, again, for our audience who may not realize this, one thing that you realize quickly is the machine will guide your movement in a plane.
Yep.
So unlike a free weight where you have to micro stabilize, right? Which if
Mm-hmm.
you're new might not be familiar, might be uncomfortable. And to your point, absolutely, possibly dangerous if you load it too much. The machine will
Yeah.
kind of start getting that muscle to have the ability to lift that weight, train it in the correct movement pattern, hopefully, with less
Yep.
risk of injury. Is that correct?
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay,
And I
excellent.
often see people by the time they get to me, most of them have some sort of injury, right? So my goal is to figure out, okay, how can we continue training or set you up for success to hit the goals that you have while also mitigating um, risk of further injury and rehabbing the current injury that you have.
Excellent. One thing I was going to ask you, it's still common practice or thought for people who are new to the fitness world or who want to exercise for fitness and health to approach, and this seems, I hate using the generalization, but very common with the female population, that the first thing that most ladies do to become fit is grab a pair of shoes and start running, which I think most people don't realize that running is a skill. And once you're not a kid, you don't run all the time. So the
Yeah.
risk of injury is severe. Do you have any comments about that cardio slash running approach versus strength training?
Yeah, oh gosh, I have a lot of opinions about this and thoughts.
Let's hear them. It's your show.
I yeah, so I was the same way when I first started, right? Like, and I think a big piece of that is social media and the influence that the media has on what is right and wrong and good for you and not good for you. And there's so much conflicting information out there. So, um, yeah, like I used to be the same way. I think cardio has its place. I also think that there is a strategic approach to integrating cardio, especially if you are a lifter, right? It depends on what your focus is. If your focus is weight loss, I would say 99% of the time start with a strength training program for a lady that is looking to lose weight. Then I would put her on a treadmill for 20
Right.
minutes a day. Um, at that kind of with that goal in mind, my goal is always to build muscle, right? You're gonna, even with weight loss, I always focus on getting somebody stronger before we lose weight. I always see that secondary, and the same thing with cardio. I see
Right.
cardio kind of as a secondary tool to use in getting somebody to their goals. But again, I'm not a run coach.
Right.
I don't specialize on form, but I do know there is a high risk of injury with somebody that is maybe just getting into training and they're
Right.
running 5 miles a day on a treadmill. The risk of hamstring tendinopathy or runner's knee or ankle problems come up. And then again, it's kind of this revolving circle of like, then people don't want to go work out again, right? Because they hurt themselves.
Right.
So
Right. It's a negative
I think
experience, then it reinforces that.
that cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
So
so that's
one
kind of
thing
my
you
thoughts
mentioned.
overall with cardio.
Oh, awesome. And well, let's dive into that a little bit because you said something really interesting. And you said, even with weight loss as the goal, say somebody who's not conditioned, who's trying to be fit. Um, for example, in my head, and we'll talk about this, GLP-1s come to mind immediately. So my thought is your approach, which by the way is the one I also espouse. It's the build muscles, and people need to understand the reason why. Which in my case, it's so more muscle means more metabolism, means
Correct.
more calories you can use. So you create that base of muscle, which is also protective. Let's not. It doesn't just
Mm-hmm.
look good.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, people. This is not about just looking good. If you chase health, you look good. If you chase looking good, you might end up being unhealthy. But in any case, is that right? Like the idea being build up that base of muscle, which is now preventive, it's healthy, and then you can start addressing that fat loss specifically from a
Correct.
higher caloric base so you don't have to suffer, right?
Correct. And I think I want to speak to a couple of things you said. The
Yes.
GLP-1 kind of trend that we're seeing right now.
Sure.
We'll start there. And again, I think there is a time and a place for people to use GLP-1s. I am not
Hmm.
going to knock that. The problem becomes when people are using this for weight loss, but they're not changing their habits and they're not changing what they're doing on a regular basis. I just saw a video on Instagram the other day of a lady raving about GLP-1 and all this weight she's losing. And she's got like every powdered supplement and protein and greens and all that she's like making this concoction and drinking. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I just feel like our healthcare system really fails people in that way. Um, and if you're going to be on GLP-1, I think you should be fully supported in managing the habit aspect of that and lifestyle change of that as well. Otherwise, I don't think you should be on GLP-1. That's my opinion.
No, I agree. I
Clinically,
agree
that
a
is
hundred
testing.
percent. And that is a message that we need to get out that GLP-1s are truly miraculous and they are a great tool and they do what they do. In my case, full disclosure, I've used microdoses of it in order to be able to maintain a bit of my fitness goals. And it works really well, for appetite suppression and so forth. However, I train fairly severely, so
Yeah.
so again, it's that balance, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing that I can think when it comes to GLP-1s is that, and you mentioned this lady with her concoctions and her idea, is that I think people have to understand that in health and fitness, it's probably 80. I always say 80% nutrition, 20% your movement,
Yeah.
and then it's just extra. The supplement stuff usually, unless you're, I don't know, addressing at some vitamin deficiency, say, or nutrient
Yeah.
deficiency, it's just this much extra. It moves the needle. So
Yeah. Yeah, and I will say, I even tell people like clients of mine, if I bring them on the team for training, most of them, the first question is, what supplements should I be taking? And my first response is, we're not talking about that until we get the plan in place. Like that is so secondary to me. And I also
yeah,
feel like if you need to be taking all these supplements all the time, we need to look at the training first, right?
yes,
I think that is most important. And again, where you're going to build those habits and those long-term results is in the training, not in the supplements. And there's a lot of good supplements out there for the right people.
sure,
But I do think without a solid training plan, the supplements are pretty irrelevant, in my opinion. So
yeah,
yeah, I think that's important. Another thing that you mentioned as well is the basal metabolic rate, with focusing
yes,
more on the strength building versus weight loss right off the bat. Any client that I see for weight loss, I will not do any sort of manipulation of calories until I've worked with them for probably 10 to 12 weeks,
gotcha.
getting a baseline understanding of where they're currently at. And then we can kind of go from there. Again, most people, if we take a look at the plan, it can almost always be manipulated to be more beneficial and effective in building muscle. A lot of people think they have a really, really good plan.
Yeah,
May or may not be the case. And especially if they've been working with a coach for a prolonged period of time, it kind of just depends. And again, it depends on the goals. So focusing on, yeah, building muscle, you're going to burn more calories at rest with the more muscle you have on your body. So I want to capitalize, especially if you are, overweight, you've got excess calories there to put to work. So let's use them. Let's build the muscle, and then we'll figure out how we're going to lose the fat, secondary to that.
absolutely. And I'm going to ask you, and I know you know the answer, but one thing for our newer people who are into fitness, there is a common misconception that, especially with calorie trackers, that you can run 500 calories worth of running and then you can eat an extra 500 calories. Can you give me your thoughts on that?
You should never eat back your calories. Number one reason being that your TDEE, which is your energy expenditure, where you use that number to calculate your maintenance
Right.
calories, um, that number already accounts for your movement. So if you're eating back those calories, you're you're really just staying at maintenance.
Right. You're just,
And a lot of people use their Apple Watches or their Fitbit to track that. The reliability of those things are not what we think.
that's
They've
right.
gotten better.
Hmm.
And there are ways to kind of, I use them as a guideline, as a tool.
Hmm.
But just because you burned 500 calories in the gym because your Apple Watch told you so, doesn't mean you probably actually burned 500 calories.
Hmm.
And I think too, this isn't women in general, but I think, or sorry, this is not specific to women, but in general, we tend to think we're working out harder than we are, right? Especially if we
Yes.
sweat or we feel like a weight is really heavy to lift. And I would
Hmm.
say most people could do more.
Right, that's true. And for whatever reason, men tend to be the opposite, that they think that they are stronger than they are. So then they will use a weight that is too heavy and inappropriate to control properly and to truly get, because we're looking for that. Honestly, it seems to me like you want to find the minimum effective dosage of exercise for your goals. You don't want to overtrain, and that's something, by the way, that we can talk about, and with women especially. It's
Yeah.
the idea of given the hormonal changes compared to men, because men are fairly stable. We're very simple. We're not complicated
Yeah.
hormonally. However,
Yeah.
like for example, rest and recovery. If you could comment a little bit on that, on the importance of that, especially for
Yeah.
women.
Yeah. And I'll share a little bit about kind of my personal experience with that too is, I at one point had gained like 20 pounds and it was when I really looked at the root of what was going on, it was stress related.
Hmm.
It was my eating habits and it was the fact that I was doing high intensity interval training 6 days a week.
Uh,
And so now knowing what I know, right, in kind of my personal experience and then also clinically, is that my nervous system and my hormones were absolutely out like off the charts. And so when I really started to evaluate kind of the stress that high intensity interval training that many times a week has on your nervous system and the hormone kind of cortisol in particular,
right.
it's crazy. And so I think to speak to your question about overall just like hormones in general with women, one thing that I feel very strongly about is fitness classes because they are set up in kind of a high intensity circuit training setup most times. I'm talking like F45 or Orange Theory
Boot
or
camp.
those types of
Okay.
boot camp classes. So like and I don't think there's a problem necessarily with that. It is the fact that women are going to those classes 4, 5, 6 times a week, thinking they're getting a good workout, and they're really just jacking their cortisol up.
Right.
And then we see overall fatigue. We see increased hunger because cortisol is spiked through the roof, and we see decreased recovery in kind of their nervous system's ability
Right.
to calm down from being stressed so frequently at such a high level. And so that is something that I think from most women's perspective, they are doing it to stay active. They don't really realize the effects until they start maybe gaining some weight. And they're like, oh, I was working out. I thought that this was supposed to help me. But it's really because it's probably not good for them to be doing it that frequently.
So let me ask you, you've mentioned the impacts of social media, especially in the psyche, if you will, of the general public. Do you feel like we're finally heading in a direction where like it's more acceptable socially to be a strong woman, to actually build muscle? Because it feels like like we've hit some kind of turning point. We're not in the I mean, I'm way older than you, I think. So we're not back in the 60s, 70s twiggy kind of
Yeah.
that social image of that being the ideal physique, if you will, for a woman, versus nowadays where you have more athletic people taking the forefront.
Yeah.
Could you comment on that? And what do you think
Yeah.
is where we're headed societally?
Yeah. Yeah, and so I'll kind of speak to kind of my personal experience, and then I'll speak to kind of where I think we're headed. And I remember when I was younger, I played sports growing up. I've always been athletic. I got involved with the gym about 9 years ago, for like working
Okay.
out. But prior to that, I played sports. And I was always, when I'd go out with my girlfriends, like they'd want to go to Pilates classes and yoga classes. And again, they have their time and their place. If you give me the option, I'm going to strength train over like yoga class, just because my brain, like, I can't, it gives me an endorphin rush to lift weights versus, so I
Sure.
always felt like I was a little bit of a black sheep in that sense of like, I was always the really strong friend. Anybody needed fitness advice, they'd come to me, they'd ask me to do their programming, whatever. And now that I, have been in kind of this space for a while, it is becoming more common. And I think there's a couple reasons. We're seeing women in high level sports being very successful.
Right.
You look at like Simone Biles, right? She's a professional gymnast
Yes.
and she is like so jacked.
Yeah.
And I'm like, how is that humanly possible? But people look to her as, even men, like they're like, wow, she's killing it, right? Like she's very
Hmm.
impressive. Um, I think her name was Alona, the rugby player in this last
Yes. Who
Olympics.
is
I mean,
incredibly jacked.
and so
Yeah.
and again, she embraces kind of that aspect. And I think that being strong is it's kind of like a puzzle, right? Like if you don't have the right plan, you could be working out for 5 years and you might not see any difference.
Right.
So I think a lot of it is, yeah, we're trending in that direction of like strong women. I feel like it's becoming more acceptable because of the successful strong women that we see in the media these days. People appreciate that a little bit more.
For sure. And another thing we're seeing, and this is a general fitness trend, but to me it seems especially noticeable in the female population, is as I'm seeing folks age, people are aging differently than they used to because they're
Yep.
more fit and more health aware. And I think a lot of people don't realize how muscle is life sparing,
Yeah.
longevity sparing.
Yeah.
So a practice like what you teach with powerlifting and strength coaching is something that,
Yeah.
again, the health makes you look good, but the health also will keep you going further
Yeah.
and further. And people don't realize, like, if the cliche, you don't use it, you lose it. But as
Right.
we age, we start losing that muscle, which is a protective tissue.
Yeah.
So I just
I
wanted to
think
like hear
too,
your opinion on that.
yeah, I think too that people are realizing slowly, at least I know in my kind of circle, that they can't rely on the United States healthcare system much anymore. So if you're not going to
Yes.
take care of yourself, you're going to fall victim to the healthcare system at some point in time, whether it's
Hmm.
now or in 20 years. So, and in 20 years, it's going to be way too late. And so I think, and that's kind of where I have found my mission in doing this, is being on the front end of the healthcare system and seeing this and how these things are dealt with in the traditional healthcare, and being so like feeling so much like my hands are tied and helping them in that setting.
Right.
Because for some people it's too late, and for some people it goes missed even at that point in time. Like I can think of one particular situation when I was working in a rehab, like an inpatient rehab facility, of an older lady that fell and broke her hip,
Oh wow.
severely
Yeah, which
obese.
is terrible.
Yeah. And again, breaking your hip at that age is often correlated with a higher risk of mortality at an
Absolutely.
earlier age. There's a direct correlation. So,
Hmm.
in particular, I think of her, and she had fallen and broken her hip, but you could tell she didn't work out at, 20, she hadn't worked out for 20 years, but it's like,
Right.
had she probably would have been fine. Right. And then it really, aggravated me to see doctors go in and talk to her about the broken leg, but nobody addressed all these lifestyle and habit problems that she's probably had for 20 years. they were attributing kind of the whole problem to the broken leg. And I'm like, her rehab probably would have been really good had she not been 100 pounds overweight. And so, but we miss that in the
Right.
traditional healthcare these days. Nobody wants to talk about the elephant in the room. They want
Hmm.
to tell people what they want to hear and say, okay, we're going to do our best. And some people make it out and some people don't, unfortunately.
Right. And traditional, I guess the traditional medical practice in the United States tends to be like problem solving when there's a problem rather than preventive. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's funny. You would think that people could go to the doctor when they're healthy and say, like, hey, what can I do to stay healthy?
Nope.
But, even
It doesn't
nutrition,
work like that. Yeah.
you know, a friend of mine explained to me, he's a physician, that his training in nutrition was literally one semester in medical school
Yeah.
20 years ago. He's my age. So there's very little, for example, how long have we heard? I've seen doctors in the last decade break out the food pyramid, with like carbs on top and
Yeah.
no clue about the importance of protein. And
Mm-hmm.
again, especially going back to women, how important it is to have that protein and those building blocks so that you can
Set
train like
yourself
you
up for
show people to
success.
train, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a huge point. I actually had a conversation with a physician for a potential client a couple of days ago. And just as I was talking to them, they were talking about, oh, I cut my carbs and I jacking my protein up. And I'm like, really? And just the philosophy of what they were currently doing, I think in my head, I expected it to be a little different. Um, and I think it really opened my eyes to the fact that, yeah, they just don't, they look at things from a clinical perspective.
Right.
And I think also your point to chronic illness management in the US
Right.
is really not good. Acute care tends to be better, traumatic injuries, the response tends to be much higher. But people with chronic illnesses, high blood pressure, diabetes, we're looking at
Right.
all these kind of factors. And as you get older, people tend to get those types of metabolic syndromes more
Sure.
frequently just with age and lifestyle. And so if you're not on top of it, at some point you're going to start slowly kind of falling behind. So I think that's a big piece that I tried to hit on as well as, if you're not going to stay on top of your health and your fitness, at some point it'll catch up to you.
Right. Right. There's no avoiding being human and aging. So
Yeah.
you reminded me of a friend of mine who recently was diagnosed with diabetes. He's
Yep.
somewhat fit, a regular person, just older. And the doctor immediately, the conversation was like, here, insulin, this is your regimen, and here's what you need to do. Not a word about maybe losing 20 pounds,
It's horrible.
lifestyle. He came to me for advice, which is bizarre because I'm not, by the way, disclaimer, this is not a medical podcast. This is not medical advice. These are two people talking about what we know, hopefully, or what we've experienced. Well, you're the doctor, actually. But you get the point. And your point is well taken, that um, it's an approach of like there's a problem and I will take care of that problem in a very micro localized way rather than having a systemic approach or a general approach to okay, we'll fix this, but in order to keep it truly fixed, we also need to work on these other things that
Yeah.
will ensure a better outcome. So,
Yeah. And I think too, a lot of it comes from instant gratification. Like people want the easy
oh,
fix. And the easy fix is often a band-aid that masks kind of the root problem for a temporary period of time until it doesn't. And again,
yeah.
there's a lot of different reasons I think that people are more so willing to pursue something that's quick and easy versus getting to the root. But oftentimes the more holistic approach takes longer and people just don't want it.
Yeah, yeah, that's a human nature thing, I think. The path of least resistance. We always hear the stories or the thought exercise of if you ever had exercise in a pill, right? Which, by the way, if you're into the biohacking space, we're actually getting close to that with certain peptides, proteins, bioregulators. But what happens to the mindset that you develop when you have the discipline to do the exercise
Right.
and do it in the traditional way? In
Right.
combination with these therapies is fine, but to what's going to happen, right? What's going to happen when people can go like, I pop this pill and I'm Captain America?
Right.
What about the mental strength and toughness and the discipline
Right.
and the things that have so much benefit in every aspect of your life, which is kind of like what you would teach as a coach, as a
Yeah.
strength coach. So,
Yeah.
anyway, if somebody wants to contact you, how would they go about doing that so that they can learn more? I would love to give you space.
Yeah. Most of my contacts just come through Instagram, at the
Okay.
Performance OT. I am very responsive on DMs on there. So shoot me a DM. I do free consultations, 30-minute consultations. So even if you don't
Awesome.
really know if you could benefit from anything that I could offer, I'm more than happy to just chat, pick your brain a little bit, throw some hard questions your way and see where we end up.
All right. And by the way, I will have all your contact info in the notes. So people, after
Perfect.
you watch this episode, check the notes, get in touch with Dr. Sam because she'll get you straight. And especially if you're new, this is the important thing. Dr. Sam's approach is absolutely perfect for the novice. Don't be
Yes.
scared. Ask the questions. Reach out. In the end, it's like, again, using the cliche, choose your hard. You can
Yeah.
do some exercise, which is hard now, or you can be ill and unhealthy and in the hospital later, maybe, possibly, or feel worse, which is hard too.
Yep.
So, again, choose your hard. Uh, Dr. Sam, thank you so much for this. This was awesome. And audience, as always, please comment, like, subscribe, the usual YouTube things. And I hope this was helpful. And with that, this is Gonzalo Herrero with Rise 41 Podcast. Remember, assess, adapt, overcome, and go get it. Thank you, everyone.